felt that inexplicable chill when you realize someone close to you is hiding something dark. That disturbing sensation that the person you live with daily might not be exactly who they appear to be. The camping trip with his silent stepfather should have been just an attempt at family bonding, but it turned into a terrifying revelation about the true nature of that mysterious man. Marcus had never managed to establish a real connection with his stepfather. Ever since his mother remarried 3 years earlier, that man had remained an enigmatic figure in the house. He rarely spoke during meals, limiting himself to polite gestures and forced smiles that never reached his piercing eyes. There was something disturbing about the way he observed everything around him, as if he were constantly analyzing, calculating, waiting for some specific moment that only he knew about. The camping idea came up during a tense dinner conversation. Marcus's mother insisted that the two of them needed to spend more time together, create family bonds that seemed non-existent despite years of living together. The stepfather nodded silently, his eyes fixed on the 17-year-old with an intensity that caused discomfort. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded hoarse, as if it wasn't used frequently. "The forest will be perfect for that." The words carried a strange weight, a veiled promise that Marcus couldn't decipher. The preparations for the trip were carried out in almost absolute silence. The stepfather meticulously organized the camping equipment, checking each item with military precision. Marcus watched how the man handled the tools with disconcerting familiarity, especially the knives and axes, testing their blades with experienced fingers. There was a predatory grace in his movements, as if each gesture was calculated for maximum efficiency. When questioned about the choice of location, the stepfather only murmured something about a special place he'd known since his youth. The trip to the forest took place in oppressive silence. The stepfather drove confidently through winding rural roads, his eyes occasionally meeting Marcus's through the rear-view mirror. There was something hypnotic in that gaze, an animal depth that made the young man instinctively look away. The landscape around them became progressively wilder and more isolated, the last houses disappearing to give way to dense forest formations that seemed to swallow the road. The air inside the car became heavy, loaded with an inexplicable tension that Marcus couldn't identify. When they finally arrived at the chosen location, Marcus understood why the stepfather had referred to that place as special. The clearing was situated in the heart of the forest, completely isolated from civilization, surrounded by ancient trees whose twisted trunks created dancing shadows even under full daylight. The silence was almost tangible, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through the leaves and indefinite sounds that seemed to come from the depths of the woods. There was something primitive about that environment, as if it were a place where normal rules of society didn't apply, where more basic and savage instincts could emerge without restraint. The camp was set up with disturbing efficiency. The stepfather moved through the clearing with disconcerting familiarity, as if he knew every stone, every exposed root, every shadow cast by the century-old trees. Marcus watched, fascinated and uneasy, as the man erected the tent without consulting instructions, his fluid and precise movements suggesting experience that went far beyond simple family camping. When questioned about his skill, the stepfather only smiled enigmatically, revealing teeth that seemed slightly sharper than normal. The first hours passed in forced normalcy. They collected firewood together, the stepfather guiding Marcus along the less obvious forest paths, demonstrating intimate knowledge about which dry branches would produce the best fire. During these walks, Marcus began to notice strange details. Footprints in the ground that seemed too large to be human, deep scratches on tree trunks situated at heights impossible for any known animal in the region, and a wild odor that seemed to emanate from certain areas. a musky and primitive smell that made his instincts alert to imminent danger. As the afternoon progressed, the stepfather's behavior became increasingly strange. He paused frequently during his activities, raising his head as if he were sniffing the air or hearing sounds that Marcus couldn't detect. His eyes took on a different quality under the filtered forest light, seeming to reflect more light than would be humanly possible. When he spoke, his voice carried growing tension, as if he were fighting against some internal impulse that threatened to emerge at any moment. Before I continue this terrifying story, let me pause here. If you're feeling that familiar chill running up your spine, that sensation that something very dark is about to be revealed, then you perfectly understand the terror that Marcus was experiencing in that isolated moment in the forest. Subscribe to the Full Moon Howls channel so you don't miss any of our supernatural horror narratives. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had the feeling that someone close was hiding a dark nature? Share your experience, because real stories often surpass any fiction we can imagine. The campfire was lit when the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The flames danced hypnotically, projecting grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The stepfather sat on the opposite side of the fire, his face partially obscured by smoke and flickering light. Marcus noticed how the man's eyes glowed with abnormal intensity, reflecting the flames in a way that made his stomach contract with anxiety. The silence between them became almost unbearable, punctuated only by the crackling of burning wood and mysterious sounds emanating from the depths of the surrounding forest. It was when the first howls echoed through the woods that Marcus understood he was about to discover something that would forever change his perception of the man his mother had chosen as a companion. The sounds were different from anything he'd ever heard. They weren't simply common wolves, but something that carried disturbing intelligence, complex communication that seemed directed specifically at their isolated clearing. The stepfather reacted to the howls in an alarming way. His entire body stiffened, his nostrils dilated as if he were deeply inhaling some specific scent, and his hands began to tremble with agitation that he desperately struggled to control. The howls intensified as darkness swallowed the forest, creating a supernatural symphony that echoed among the trees with impossible coordination. Marcus counted at least 5 different voices, each responding to the others in complex communication that suggested intelligence beyond common animal instinct. The stepfather remained motionless on the other side of the fire, but Marcus could see subtle transformations occurring in his face. His features seemed more angular under the dancing light, facial muscles contracted in an expression of intense concentration, as if he were hearing specific messages in those savage calls. The night temperature seemed to drop drastically, but the stepfather began to sweat profusely. Drops of sweat ran down his forehead and neck, his clothes sticking to his body uncomfortably. Marcus watched with growing alarm as the man's hands contracted repeatedly, fingers curving like imaginary claws, scratching the air with involuntary movements that suggested a desperate internal struggle. When their gazes met through the flames, Marcus saw something that terrified him. The stepfather's pupils had dilated completely, creating an abyssal depth that seemed to suck all available light. The first physical sign of the imminent transformation came when the stepfather tried to drink water from his bottle. His hands trembled so violently that he could barely hold the container, and when he finally brought the opening to his lips, Marcus saw with horror that the man's teeth had perceptibly elongated. They were no longer the slightly sharp canines he'd noticed before, but genuine fangs that slightly tore his own lips, causing small trickles of blood that he wiped with his shirt sleeve, leaving dark stains on the fabric. The transformation accelerated when the howls became closer and more insistent. The stepfather began to moan softly, a guttural sound that didn't seem completely human. His muscles contracted under his skin as if something were moving independently beneath the surface. Marcus watched, fascinated and terrified, as the man's hair seemed to darken and thicken, growing visibly along his hairline and down the sides of his face. The shape of his skull seemed to be subtly altering, his jaw projecting forward while his nose flattened, taking on characteristics that vaguely resembled a canine snout. The stepfather's clothes began to tighten as his musculature expanded unnaturally. The orange shirt he wore stretched to its limit, the seams protesting under the pressure of growing muscles. Marcus could hear fabric tearing at specific points, especially around the shoulders and chest, where the transformation seemed most intense. The man visibly fought against the process, his hands gripping his own chest, as if trying to physically contain the changes occurring within him, but it was clearly a losing battle against forces that transcended his conscious will. It was when the stepfather raised his transformed eyes and fixed them directly on Marcus that the young man understood the true extent of the danger he was in. Those were no longer human eyes observing him through the campfire flames. They were the eyes of an ancestral predator, loaded with primitive hunger and savage intelligence that evaluated its prey with the patience of an experienced hunter. Recognition was still present in that gaze. The stepfather still knew who Marcus was, but it was being rapidly overcome by more basic and terrifying instincts that made no distinction between family and food. The complete transformation happened with a speed that defied any rational understanding. The stepfather arched his back violently, a guttural roar escaping from his throat, while the last vestiges of his humanity were consumed by the bestial nature that emerged. His orange shirt finally tore completely, hanging in tatters from his torso, now covered by a disturbing mixture of human skin and irregular patches of dark, coarse hair. The hair that had once been short and combed back had spread across his entire face and neck, creating a wild mane that framed unrecognizable features. Marcus watched with paralyzing terror as the stepfather's nose and mouth definitively projected into a partially formed snout, still maintaining enough human traits to make the sight even more disturbing. The fangs that had begun as elongated canines were now genuine weapons, curved and sharp, gleaming in the firelight, while thick saliva dripped between them. The eyes, although maintaining their basic human shape, burned with animal fury that was simultaneously intelligent and completely savage, as if two distinct consciousnesses fought for control of the same transformed body. The creature that had once been his stepfather rose slowly, its posture still fundamentally human, but its movements now loaded with predatory grace that made every fiber of Marcus's being scream alerts of mortal danger. One of its hands, now equipped with long, curved claws, remained pressed against its muscular chest, as if the creature still fought against the impulses that dominated it. The other hand was raised toward Marcus, fingers extended threateningly, each claw catching and reflecting the orange firelight in a hypnotic and terrifying way. The growl that emanated from the creature's throat was a sound Marcus would never forget. It wasn't completely animal nor totally human, but a horrible fusion of both that created impossible harmonies of rage and pain. It was as if the stepfather was still conscious of his transformation, fighting against it, but being inexorably dominated by millennial instincts that demanded hunting, blood, and satisfaction of hungers that transcended any normal human need. The creature occasionally tilted its head, as if hearing commands whispered by the distant howls that continued echoing through the forest. Marcus understood in that moment that his life depended on decisions he would make in the next few seconds. The creature was clearly divided between family recognition and predatory impulses, but this hesitation wouldn't last forever. The howls around the clearing became more insistent, as if others of its kind were approaching, attracted by the smell of transformation and the promise of a coordinated hunt. The young man could feel invisible eyes watching him from the shadows between the trees, presences waiting for the right moment to emerge and participate in whatever was about to happen in that cursed clearing. The fire began to diminish, its flames losing intensity as the wood was consumed, creating deeper shadows and areas of total darkness where anything could be hidden. The creature took advantage of this change in lighting to move through the clearing with calculated steps, each movement testing Marcus's reactions, evaluating his escape options, studying its prey with the patience of a predator that had all night to complete its hunt. The tatters of the orange shirt swayed like macabre flags in the night wind, visual reminders of the humanity that had been irreversibly lost in that terrifying transformation. The silent confrontation between Marcus and the transformed creature prolonged for eternal minutes, each second loaded with tension that threatened to explode at any moment. The young man forced himself to remain motionless, instinctively understanding that any sudden movement could trigger the beast's hunting reflexes. The creature continued studying him with those human eyes full of fury and pain, as if two distinct personalities fought for control. The stepfather who still recognized his stepson, and the ancestral beast that saw only vulnerable prey waiting to be killed. The howls around the clearing intensified, creating a supernatural chorus that seemed to communicate complex hunting strategies. Marcus could distinguish at least 7 different voices now, each responding to the others in patterns that suggested military coordination. The creature in front of him reacted to the calls by tilting its head, its ears, now slightly pointed and covered with hair, moving independently to capture nuances in the sounds that completely escaped Marcus's human perception. It was evident that a complete pack surrounded his position, awaiting signals from their leader to initiate a coordinated attack. It was when the creature opened its mouth and tried to speak that Marcus experienced the deepest terror of his entire life. The sounds that emerged were a grotesque mixture of human words distorted by completely altered vocal anatomy. Cuss. The voice was unrecognizable, raspy and guttural, as if produced by vocal cords that weren't designed to form human language. Run. The next word was clearer, and Marcus understood with absolute horror that the creature was trying to warn him, that some vestige of his stepfather's consciousness still fought against bestial instincts to protect him from the fate that awaited. The creature's internal battle became physically visible. It pressed both hands against its chest now, claws tearing its own skin while fighting against impulses that threatened to dominate it completely. Blood flowed between its fingers, further staining the tatters of the orange shirt that hung from its transformed body. Its muscles contracted violently, as if opposing forces pulled its essence in conflicting directions. The eyes alternated between moments of desperate recognition and periods of pure animal fury, creating a terrifying vision of a soul divided against itself. Marcus took advantage of this momentary distraction to evaluate his escape options. The surrounding forest seemed completely hostile, each shadow potentially hiding another similar creature, each trail possibly leading to natural traps from which he could never escape. But remaining in the clearing meant certain death when the creature's mental transformation was completed, and the last vestiges of humanity were definitively consumed by predatory instincts. The howls became more impatient, as if the pack were losing patience with their transformed members' hesitation. The decision came when the creature raised its transformed head toward the crescent moon shining through the treetops and let out a howl that made Marcus's blood freeze in his veins. It was a sound that contained all the pain of transformation, all the rage of lost humanity, and all the ancestral hunger of a species that had hunted humans since the dawn of civilization. When the creature lowered its gaze again, Marcus saw that the last traces of recognition had completely disappeared. What observed him now was purely predator, and the time for hesitation had definitively ended. Marcus made the only decision left to him. He ran. His feet shot toward the nearest trail, while behind him erupted a deafening chorus of furious howls. The creature that had been his stepfather let out a roar of frustration and rage that echoed through the forest like the war cry of a supernatural army. The sound of breaking branches and violently trampled foliage indicated that the chase had begun, not just from the transformed creature, but from the entire pack that had been waiting in the surrounding shadows. The flight through the nocturnal forest became a nightmare of invisible obstacles and imaginary terrors. Marcus stumbled over exposed roots, scratched himself on low branches, and constantly looked over his shoulder to glimpse shadows moving with impossible speed between the trees. The howls behind him multiplied, creating a hunting symphony that seemed to come from all directions simultaneously. Sometimes he was sure he saw bright eyes watching him from specific points, but when he focused his attention on those areas, he found only impenetrable darkness and ominous silence. The pursuit took on surreal qualities as Marcus deepened into the dense woods. The sounds seemed to distort, reaching him from impossible angles, as if the forest itself were conspiring to disorient him and facilitate his capture. Occasionally, he heard what seemed to be his own voice screaming for help from distant locations, impossible echoes that suggested the hunt had transcended normal laws of physics and taken on supernatural characteristics that defied any rational understanding. When he finally emerged from the forest hours later, Marcus was in complete shock. His clothes were torn, his body covered with scratches and bruises, his eyes wild with the trauma of having witnessed the impossible transformation of someone he knew. The authorities he eventually sought treated his story as delirium caused by trauma and exposure, especially when no trace of the stepfather or the campsite could be found at the location he insisted had been their exact location. The investigators found only the empty clearing, with no signs of a fire, no camping equipment, no evidence that two people had spent time at that location. The only clues were strange footprints in the ground, impressions that seemed to gradually transition from human shoes to paws of some unknown animal, and deep scratches on several trees that suggested claws of impossible size for any species native to the region. The wildlife specialists consulted couldn't identify what type of creature could have left such marks. Marcus's mother never saw her husband again. He simply disappeared completely, as if he had never existed, leaving only disturbing memories and a traumatized young man whose sanity would be permanently questioned. Marcus developed a deep phobia of full moons and forests, frequently waking during the night with the sensation that he was being watched by eyes that glowed in the darkness. Sometimes, during particularly quiet nights, he could still hear distant howls that seemed to contain familiar echoes of a voice that had tried to warn him to run. If this story awakened that ancestral fear we all carry about what might be hidden among those who surround us, subscribe to the Full Moon Howls channel for more narratives that explore the supernatural terrors that inhabit the borders between human and bestial. Tell us in the comments about your own experiences with situations where you felt something wasn't completely right, where instincts screamed alerts that reason tried to ignore. Your stories might be more real than you imagine, and our community is here to hear every terrifying account you want to share with us.